And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. It's fantastic to be here. It's already an amazing crowd asking great questions, and tonight's going to be a very, very special episode. As usual, oh, there's somebody asking great questions. That's a good one. Olivia,
Hi,
it's great
everybody.
to see you.
Yes.
Unbelievable. Now, we're beyond happy to have Olivia here because this is her second show back. And she's been kind of coming up with some great stuff this week. So we're going to really have a fabulous show tonight. But it's great to have you back.
It's so good to be back.
And everyone's so relieved. And I can stop getting that sort of rush of emails nonstop about, where's Olivia? Which I definitely answered each and every one. As you know.
Sure you did.
But tonight's very special. It's X Series episode 65. And this episode is, who is Tom Garden? This is such an important question in our examination of the Hot Zone. And that's why tonight is a history-making episode. When we leave tonight, we'll have something that's not in the history books, and we'll be able to take an entire group and identify them that just was not on the radar previously, and it's going to open up all kinds of things. So I'm very excited about this. Also, I want to say that it dovetails so nicely with the last few episodes that we've done. The previous episode, of course, with Howard Hughes, and Howard Hughes makes another appearance in this episode. I also would tie this X Series 65 episode to the Howard Hughes episode from last June. They're all kind of moving together there as one whole. Yes.
And some unexpected episodes, right? There's a pretzel shape when it comes to connecting these dots tonight.
Oh, there's no question about it. There's no question about it. It's quite extraordinary because what we're going to get into is in the Hot Zone, which is this area that we identify in this program, which is between the Yucatan on one side and the Yucatan Peninsula, and say about the island of Bimini, the coast of Florida, with Cuba sandwiched right in the middle, and it leans over into Belize and parts of the Caribbean. The general kind of traditional way that we look at this is right here, and we can see from these dots where the real kind of finds have been. That's where Polina Zalitsky found the Cuban city underwater in 2001. And over here is where they found the Bimini Road. So those two are very important when we're getting into what's going on there in the Hot Zone geopolitically and otherwise. But tonight, what we've been able to do is look at the figures that have been down there that we've done programs on extensively in the Hot Zone, like Ernest Hemingway, like Howard Hughes. And you're going to see Charles Lindbergh is in here tonight too. So this is extraordinary. Lucky Lindy makes a very fascinating appearance, and that's going to dovetail even further. And, you know, just taking a kind of a look at Bimini and how important it is, I have to mention, of course, that the incredible destruction by Hurricane Dorian to the people down there, it's amazing the things that we're seeing. And so we're praying all along that those people are doing okay and surviving. Dorian even hit land here, but nothing like the kind of devastation it did in the Hot Zone. They even got President Trump to kind of put up his map of the Hot Zone. It was quite extraordinary just to see him in that area, checking it out, getting it together. And it's quite fascinating because he's watching that cone there, and his you have to wonder about Trump and what he knows in relation to the Hot Zone, but much of his future lies there for sure in terms of his success. Another thing I want to mention is that when we are looking at the Hot Zone, we want to look at it from three different directions, which is absolutely crucial. The esoteric angle has to do with the readings of Edgar Cayce, and that he gave these readings which are well known in mystery school circles, that there's going to be land rising up out of the Atlantic. And that land, when it rises, is going to contain ruins of an earlier civilization. This is going to be quite something to process, you might say. I mean, what would happen, you know, if they just found that out of the blue? It would be, hey, there's an advanced civilization that was underwater, and those, were basically the progenitors of all that. Now, we're moving into this phase, but they were ready in the 60s and 70s. A lot of people had started to assimilate the mystery school work, the work of Edgar Cayce through the author Jess Stern in 1968, The Sleeping Prophet, brought forward Cayce as a bestseller. Really, before that, he was a very marginalized figure, and I would say also that Cayce in his own life was destitute most of his life, which is why I think the quality of his readings, in a sense, is so good. Not that you have to be, it's not that those conditions equal a kind of purity. It's just that sometimes without the clutter and the marketing that goes along with it, you can really get some incredible quality. And one of the things I think that we can say about Cayce is that he spent a lot of time as a photographer. So he really balanced his life out that way, and people came to him and sort of dragged him into this psychic arena because of his amazing abilities. Well, one of those groups that dragged him into this arena were these very unusual businessmen from New York who wanted readings about Bimini. And some of the things that he opened up in relation to Bimini talked about how there was a temple off the coast of Bimini that was going to rise, and that we could expect to actually see it in 68 and 69. I think with these guys and the readings, they were so interested in what they could get in terms of treasure, in terms of gold, in terms of all these types of things, that they actually took Cayce into the hot zone, and Cayce went to Bimini to give them more readings. And so this is quite interesting because the readings themselves give us the indication that Bimini is the main remnant of Poseidia, which is the main city in Atlantis, and that off the coast this temple would rise, and that it would have these records relating to Atlantis. Now, on the surface, we have this as a kind of prediction, and then he said expect it in 68 and 69. So in 68, J. Manson Valentine, who's a pilot, is flying over there, and he sees these ruins that are in just about 20 feet of water, and they look like a long wall circling Bimini on the northern side. And so this is the kind of the genesis of where we get into the Bimini aspect. When we get to Cuba, we get into Polina Zalitsky's find, which was really flashed across every major newspaper, from the New York Times to the Washington Post, and they didn't know what to do with it because the news dispatch was coming from Cuba. It was very hard to keep down, so they sort of hung with the story for a while, and then they suppressed it later. Some of the ruins she found off the western tip of Cuba are there. These are her pictures, and for me, in my discussions with her, she told me that the ruins spread out so that they're like a metropolitan area, basically. And I hope to be speaking more with Paulina as well. Edgar Cayce attributed a lot to this area of the hot zone, and he was telling us that this was part of a wave of things that were changing, a series of earth changes that were involved. Now, we've detailed richly the connections between the Hemingway family and the Cayce family, and the fact that Ernest Hemingway was in Bimini, and I recommend those episodes, starting with episode 36, I think. And there are also some very kind of fascinating links that we just put together in July with Ernest Hemingway. The Hemingway aspect of this has to be very well understood because it put a tremendous amount of pressure on him, and whatever he was up to there, he was putting it in a vault, and then the Kennedy administration tried to get that vault out of Cuba and risked a national security incident. It's all on record. And, it's attributed to things like poems and stuff. I don't think it was poems that they were looking for. Later, Hemingway's son, Jack, who's a major CIA agent, would have two daughters who were very famous in celebrity circles. One of them nominated for an Academy Award, and the other an incredible model. That's Margot and Mariel. And Margot committed suicide in the 90s, talking about how there was strange pressure on her family. And this theme goes along with things that other Hemingways have to say as well. So the Hemingways are a major key player in this between Bimini and Cuba and all the geopolitical machinations that go on in the hot zone. Yes, Miss Lydia.
Is there any way to turn up your mic a little bit? I guess you're a little low.
Oh, that's interesting. Sure. I mean, I can just jack the volume up a little bit here,
Okay.
but it should be all right. It's showing up pretty decent. So So far, so grand. I'll remind everyone that you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, and we're going deep now into the hot zone. I guess one of the important aspects that we have to keep in mind is in this progression of episodes, we're looking at geopolitical aspects, we're looking at the mystery school esoteric aspects, and we're bringing in those guests also who can help us form that larger picture. But we're in a time of discovery, and this is something I think that has to really stand out for us. So we're going to keep this balance between these issues. So when we look at the geopolitical issues around Cuba, we could say, Venezuela and Russia are angling to put pressure on the United States, and that the United States is trying to put pressure on Cuba to play ball, and so we're giving them economic sanctions, and that there's drug running by the CIA all throughout the region and all throughout the hemisphere. So, we can look at those are the kind of surface and some of the deeper geopolitical aspects. However, there's an entirely huge esoteric aspect relating to these ruins, because the Atlanteans, as Cayce described it, had incredible technological abilities, and the location of where this is also lends itself to those incredible capabilities. So there are a number of governments who are engaged in what I discussed with Dr. Farrell, which are archaeological wars for these ruins, because they feel they'll have all these advantages, but also because of the incredible qualities and properties that are ascribed by those ancient writers to these very extensive ruins underwater related to this advanced civilization. The Atlanteans possessed a technology we are rediscovering. So we're positing here on the Cayce line, on the mystery school line, that this is a rediscovery of technology. We're rediscovering rocketry. We're rediscovering all these things. So if we think of it that way, then we're kind of moving into the right mental framework to understand this. But there's a hardcore kind of psychic consciousness aspect to it. It can't be denied, and you can't just look at this straight up scientifically and try to get it. You have to take in the political, scientific, and psychic side and bring them into focus. And that's what we're going to do here tonight with the help of people like Howard Hughes. Now, Olivia, you know that I always like the TKO.
Yes.
There's no denying the TKO when we start out. So instead of waiting for the big reveal of who Tom Garden is, and I should mention, I guess, that Tom Garden is identified in the Autobiography of Howard Hughes by Clifford Irving, which is very controversial and was revealed officially to be something that was not Howard Hughes's autobiography, which is very unusual because we'll get into that some more. But as I outlined, Clifford himself originally stood up for his book and all the rest of it and passed lie detector tests, and there were a number of experts who read it. And then we had this very unusual press conference where Howard Hughes comes out, but he's only on the phone talking to these reporters, so he doesn't make a personal appearance. And there were things floating around in that period, like the gemstone file, that suggested that basically Hughes had either died or that he had been, he had been kind of confined by the Central Intelligence handlers through this group of Mormons that he was connected to.
Mormons?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
It goes deep. Mormons are in the hot zone. You know the episode's coming. But it's fantastic. The setup for tonight's episode is just off the charts. As you can see, this is an all-nighter. There's no question about it. However, I'm going to do my best to condense it. And one of the things I do want to mention also is that Hughes, the reason that they would have the kind of motivation to do this to Hughes is that he commanded the largest fortune in America at the time. So it would be like, an easy way for them to launder money to control his empire. And so Hughes is almost like a Bill Gates. You have to think of him in these terms. And when we look back at Hughes, all the stories are, oh, he's eccentric, he had long fingernails, and he was a germaphobe. That's just the spin that they put out there. There's no question he developed issues later in life. But if you really look back at his career, he developed Hughes Aerospace, which was the leading edge for getting us into space. he developed, so much of the aviation background that we grew up with back there. And if we also look at him as a historical figure, he's a major, big-time Hollywood producer. So this guy had so many different facets to him, and he was very active politically. And I think what happened is somewhere along the line, they used people in his life like Robert Mayhew, who was an FBI, CIA guy, and who never met Hughes but ran half his empire. This is part of the kind of complexity. And they would convince him, well, this is patriotic, or this will be good for the country if you help us do this, and we're going to do this backdoor thing. And he would get favors in return from people like President Nixon, for example, who would grant him, as vice president, would grant him a nonprofit status for his aerospace wing to become a medical charity. You figure that one out. Well, you don't have to pay any taxes on it. That's handy. So we certainly get a picture there when we think about Hughes. So while we're looking at Hughes in this autobiography, Clifford Irving's controversial autobiography, Howard Hughes states that he met Ernest Hemingway, and that he actually met him in Idaho, and then that they went to Cuba. Now, this is all very interesting because on the record, there's no record of him meeting Hemingway in regular official terms. Now, there's a few interesting things about this because much of Clifford Irving's controversial autobiography of Howard Hughes supposedly was drawn from an official source who was close to Hughes, which is why it was so convincing. But there's a lot of things that were going on here. Probably we might want to think of it as one group, let's call them X-Share, as we've demonstrated on this program, trying to push another group, X-Protect, which likes to lock up secrets and keep technologies and other knowledge hidden from the public, try to force them out by saying, here's this autobiography by Howard Hughes, and if Howard Hughes is alive, he'll come out and repudiate it. And instead, they sent this guy up on a telephone to have a press conference. So he never actually did come out and do it. His estate said that this wasn't the real thing. So there's an awful lot of controversy there. But in the middle of all that, during this conversation in the autobiography that he's having with Ernest Hemingway, he says, "My name is Tom Garden." And he uses the pseudonym Tom Garden over and over again in that chapter when dealing with Hemingway. Now, the name itself stands out dramatically because it's unusual on a number of levels. First of all, he's Howard Hughes. So people in the 1950s knew Howard Hughes very, very well. So to be walking around using a pseudonym with Ernest Hemingway, who's another well-known figure, is very strange, shall we say. Later, he gives the reason for using the name as that it was associated with a soldier that he knew in the hottest part of Ethiopia. And that's basically the hottest place on earth. This is strange too, because we've got that whole reference to heat and the hot zone. So we're going in very unusually. And his conversations with Hemingway are very strange as well. I'm going to read just a little bit of it, and then I'm going to give you the TKO of who Tom Garden is, and then we'll reverse engineer it from there. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is X Series episode 65, and we're going deep into the hot zone to find out who Tom Garden is. And along the way, we've already run into Ernest Hemingway and Howard Hughes. We're going to run into Lucky Lindy, Charles Lindbergh, and along with some very, very unusual connections for Tom Garden. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Can I start with a quick question?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
Yes.
Jeremy Dark Eagle wants to know right away, has the hurricane stirred up the hot zone, revealing new structures?
Well, there's no question. Most of the things, just like the Bimini Road was discovered right after a hurricane. And originally the Bimini Road was discovered in 1926, I found out, which is interesting, but it was not fully there, and it was only uncovered briefly because of a hurricane. But when we think of structures, massive structures like this, and we think of Paulina Zalitsky and what she said about the metropolitan city under there, this is a whole part of our history that we need to discover. And any time that there are major hurricanes that move through the area, right afterwards, it's a fantastic time, provided the weather permits, to go over there and start doing this kind of probing. And I think the majority of the efforts now, since Cuba is such a hot button area, I would love to find a way to get in there and do it, but Bimini is really the one that I would approach. And, we hear so many distraction things around Atlantis. There are important finds in other places. There's no question about it. But the constant redirection to Antarctica is tricky because Antarctica is very important, and there's incredible indications from lost maps, like the Piraeus map, that at one point there was no ice there and there was a civilization there. So it is very important. But Atlantis is very important in that it was identified specifically, and that beyond that, it was identified where we're pointing to it. So I think that this is significant. And then when we get into the Cayce readings, of course, he has done the most extensive psychic cognitive work around searching those ruins and searching and the importance of what they are and the technology that they represent for a very ancient lost culture. So we have to think of it that way, which is, we have to watch out for the redirect that's happening and say every find all over the world is important and interesting, and there are fascinating areas, but the hot zone is something that we can kind of have access to. And it was identified directly by the mystery schools through Cayce, saying this temple, the first rising is going to be this temple of Bimini, which is the Poseidia temple, and we're already seeing aspects of his predictions come true on that. I think it needs the greater investigation, and it's here. You have a lot of these guys who run around on Gaia TV being like, oh, there's a UFO buried in a pyramid in Antarctica. Well, we'll never get a look at that. I can't. I mean, you have a better chance of getting something on your telescope in outer space than seeing something in Antarctica. We'll never be able to prove anything. So it's nice for us to theorize, and we can certainly backtrack things that are there, like industry that's there, for example, or if a whistleblower comes off. That's great, but I'll tell you, it's very hard for us to examine Antarctica. However, Bimini is pretty easily accessible. It's only 50 miles off of Miami, so we could get there in about 45 minutes, let's say. I would definitely say that this is one area that's very doable, and with the accumulation of information and knowledge about it, we definitely have to go for it. But that is a great question, my God. It's moving into a full house tonight. We have a great crowd, and tonight is special. We are going for history tonight because in our investigations, we're starting to uncover things that weren't on the record, and now they're going to be. Yes.
Okay, so Victor Surge says, what's the connection between Bimini and Cuba? I just don't get it.
Well, between Bimini's ruins, which is the Bimini Road or Bimini Wall, which a number of researchers have looked at, and I just showed pictures of, on one side, and then on the other side is the Cuban city, and then on the other side of that is the Yucatan Peninsula. In all three of those places, there have been ruins spotted, and there are also extensive readings that Cayce left behind indicating that this area was Poseidia, which was a major center of Atlantis. Now, I've been contacted by someone who did oceanographic studies, and they contacted me in an interesting way. They didn't do it through email. And they told me that there's an area down there between Bimini and Cuba that's called the hot zone, because you're not supposed to be able to report things that you see down there when you're working for these private contractor companies. Now, I imagine the same is absolutely true when it comes to the military. I don't know. I haven't spoken to military people about this, but I will say this. I have talked to experts who, under their own breath, knew this term, the hot zone. So the hot zone is known to those who are doing the work. And so that's what gave us that great hint. That was about a year and a half ago that I got that information. And that's, I've looked around this whole Bimini Cuba aspect since the information's come out. I've been studying the Cayce readings for so many years that when somebody said hot zone, those two things clicked very well for me, because it makes sense to me. The ruins are so extensive that if you report them, then it lets the genie out of the bottle. We also have something which is important, which is these celebrities buying up lots in the Atlantic Ocean, the way Ernest Hemingway's brother did, thinking that when the land rises, and there's people like John Lennon did this and Yoko Ono, they'll buy spots in the ocean. So when the land rises, it's basically like a sovereign nation. So they're hoping when they do that, they can start this whole thing. So there's a whole political aspect to this too when there is land rising off the East Coast. So we get into some interesting complexities, I'd say, when you start to deal with the hot zone. But that is the area, and you could basically say off the coast of Florida over to the Yucatan Peninsula with a big stop on the western tip of Cuba. That's a good outline. But yeah, if you watch any of the hot zone shows, I always identify where it is. Okay, that's pretty important. Great questions tonight, and remember.
Can I jump to?
Yeah, let me
really
just say in
juicy
the second part of the program, we're going to do questions throughout. So we're going to do a big Q&A. So Olivia will take your questions in all caps. You can ask them now, and she's going to put them together as only she can.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what do you got?
Nicholas Krupis wanted to know, is there any possible nexus between Howard Hughes and other paperclip Nazis?
Oh, absolutely.
Are we going to touch on that tonight?
Well, the Nazi aspect is very important when you get to Hughes and when you're dealing with Nixon, because Nixon was overseeing a lot of that, in the Galen operation and all the rest of it. So there's no question about it that the Nazis and their impact on our scientific know-how when we recruited them after we won the war, it plays such a major role in their role going into universities and Werner von Braun commandeering our space program. The Nazis played a major role. Remember, the Soviets recruited all their Nazi scientists also. They grabbed their share and we grabbed ours. But I think that we got a better cream of the crop. And we got some great advantages from that, but they kind of maintained this Marshall style philosophy. And so bringing that into our national security institutions was always making a deal with the devil. And so this is what people like JFK had real issues with and try to root out in government. And I think that battle is ongoing. There's no question that the Nazi sort of commandeering of NASA is something that you can watch through that whole paperclip process. But they've spread out into other areas too, including medical areas. Which is a terrifying thought there, vaccine nation. I didn't even want to think it. I like that. I'm so expecting Olivia to jump on that one because that's a big issue.
We're not even going to go there tonight.
I can appreciate it. All right, everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. One of the things you want to do before we get into this is go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter you get once a week that will tell you what shows are coming up and also where they're going to be, what the guest is, and all the rest of it. And the way it works, basically, you'll get one newsletter on Friday. It'll just give you a heads up on everything that's happening. But you have to do that because what happens most of the time with social media is it's very largely undependable. They may shadow ban something that's important. God knows, they might shut off all the channels that are doing the good information. As the hot zone information crosses those lines, I guess it gets more and more to be a hot potato. So my suggestion, make sure that you're with the newsletter and you have that pipeline directly to us. That's what makes all the difference. Now, what I'm going to do is get into Tom Garden.
Okay.
And one of the things I asked her, and this was really fantastic that you guys did this, and my hat's off to you, which is, I asked you to interpret the name Tom Garden as an anagram or otherwise, and a number of you came up with some significant, interesting interchanges there of letters and ideas, and some of the best ones were Magnet Rod was a really great one, and Tom Danger, which is very significant to what's happening. Those names were all good, and it was good moving those around. I spent a good deal of time on this, and I have identified who Tom Garden is. And I'm going to show you right now something very interesting and then reveal who he is. And remember now, Tom Garden showed up, that's supposedly Howard Hughes using the pseudonym Tom Garden in the controversial Autobiography of Howard Hughes by Clifford Irving. And this is an interesting historical fact in relation to that book, which is all of the things that happened in that book did take place. The only thing that they can't verify is this Hemingway meeting. So it's very unusual that it's there in the first place. Why did he bother putting it in if it was a fictional account? Why just include that Hughes hung out with Hemingway for 9 years and calling himself Tom Garden? This is what struck me when I was reading it. It bothered me the way that certain things bother me around these types of studies. When things stand out like that, you usually find at the end of that search there's something to be uncovered, and sometimes that can be absolutely massive, as is the case tonight. So I do want to read the script here from the autobiography of when he first mentions this. And he said, he decides the occasion arose just after the war, sometime in the winter of 1948. This is from Clifford Irving's autobiography. This is supposedly Howard Hughes talking to him. When I went out to look over Sun Valley, Idaho, with the idea in mind of buying it and making it into a popular resort area, I flew out there in my bomber, a converted B-25. I knew Ernest was there with his family, first name basis, before he meets him. It's kind of unusual. And he was hunting, so I found out where he was living. I did something wholly uncharacteristic. I marched right up to his door and knocked on it. He opened it. I hadn't gone out to Sun Valley as Howard Hughes. Traveling under the name Howard Hughes is the kiss of death. The people who own Sun Valley would have jacked the price up 50% just on that knowledge alone. I was using the name Tom Garden. I knew a Tom Garden very briefly once. I met him out in Ethiopia in 1946. That's just 2 years previous to this. A young Englishman who wanted to go exploring in the Danakil part of the country. That's the hottest, one of the hottest place in Africa. So then he goes on, and then he's talking to Ernest Hemingway, who's at the door, and he said, I was struck by his reception. I myself, well, the occasion never arose where some stranger would come up and knock to my door, first of all. But there's Ernest at the door, and so they do this whole back and forth, and he keeps mentioning the name Tom Garden. It's like, okay, we get it, you're using the name Tom Garden. What's going on here? And then he is going back and forth with Hemingway about, let's go pilot out, let's go fly. I brought my B-25, let's go fly around. Eventually they go flying around and swimming around in Cuba, in the hot zone. And so they get into, all of these different things that they talk about, and it all is a very unusual and what I feel is a very coded conversation. But, at different points, Ernest Hemingway will look at him and say, Tom Garden, you are one hot pilot. So little things that...
Can I just say, I realized, we talked about this week, but it sounds very Twin Peaksy or something.
It does, yeah, oh yeah.
Very self-conscious, very odd.
Absolutely.
It's certainly not good writing, when
Very
you
much
repeat it
so.
like that.
Very much so.
So
Also,
you're dangling a clue, and you keep dangling it.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, I've come to the conclusion that the entire autobiography was to force the fake Howard Hughes out of the shadows and to put the spotlight on Tom Garden. Now, as it turned out, it sort of bamboozled back on Irving, but we'll get into that as well. But yes, absolutely. Very unusual dialogue. Okay, this is Clifford Irving, who wrote the autobiography of Hughes, and later would say, yes, it was all something that I worked with writers to make up. However, when he first came out, he vehemently denied it and passed lie detector tests, etc. So it's all very interesting. Of course, there were people like Irving who did go to prison for 1.5 years. So you could say the official story lines up there, yes, However, what I think could have also happened here is that Irving took the details of what was going to be Hughes's autobiography from his trusted aide who was going to let this out. It didn't happen on his side. I think that he was going to be the front man, Irving, and that this was all a plan to oust the phony CIA Howard Hughes, because They thought he'd have to give a press conference. Instead, the media let him off with calling in. And that footage is still on YouTube. It's the biggest joke in the world because it just sounds like somebody doing a bad Howard Hughes impression. And I've talked to people and had them listen to it, and over again, it comes up the same way. It does not sound like Hughes at all.
So what's the story with this trusted aide and the original autobiography?
Well, that is definitely another important piece of the story, which is, well, we're going to get into that actually, but hold that one because that gets right into what Irving was doing, and it is very important, but bring it back up. Okay, now I want you to take a look at someone, and I want you to take note that his name is Sanche de Gramont, and that's him in 1961. Sanche wrote...
Is it Sanche? I think it's Sanche.
Oh, really?
Probably.
Oh, Sanche, yes, yes, exactly. Sanche de Gramont, but I'll tell you, there's an interesting thing about the pronunciation because when they said it now, this is very interesting. When you listen to his recordings, it doesn't come out, so maybe that's part of getting rid of the French. But let's think about this. De Gramont is here in 1961, and he is using this name. He wrote a book called The Secret War, which is all about intelligence gathering, and he is engaged in very unusual French-Algerian military, as a military journalist, and he's no question an intelligence operative. Now, the de Gramont family is very interesting also, and we're going to give them a very interesting overview tonight, quite fascinating from every angle. Next up, I want you to take a look at a book by de Gramont, and that is called The Way Up, and it is the memoirs of Count Gramont. Very interesting indeed, their family crest, which we're also going to take a deep look at. But I want you to take a look at this book, because this book is called The Way Up, the memoirs of Count Gramont, a novel. It's the same book. Interesting thing about the author. His name is now Ted Morgan.
Is that an anagram?
It is indeed. Sanche de Gramont. Same book, different cover. Ted Morgan, The Way Up, the memoirs of Count Gramont. Keep that in mind. And again, keep our friend Gramont, de Gramont, in mind. Now, let's take a look at a very interesting article out of the New York Times archives called Poor Big Rich Man. And it's by Ted Morgan, all about and extensively about Howard Hughes. And this is in 1977, 1 year after Hughes' death. The articles is available in their archive, and there's more from that, but it's ostensibly what happens inside the article is Morgan gives a big overview on Hughes and all of the failings and the unusual, bizarreness of him, etc. So now, take a look at this. Pulitzer Prizes. De Gramont, there he is again. Ted Morgan, in parentheses, New York Herald Tribune and the New York Times. So, Sanche de Gramont is Ted Morgan. Ted Morgan is an anagram of Tom Garden, but it's also an anagram of de Gramont. So Tom Garden is an anagram of de Gramont. Let's go a little bit further. Tom Morgan was born Count Sanche Charles Armand Gabriel de Gramont
Ooh la la.
in Geneva, Switzerland. He's the son of Gabriel Antoine Armand Count de Gramont, a pilot in the French escadrille, and the Gramonts are an old French noble family. Yes, indeed they are. This only gets better. Now, in the 1970s, Morgan stopped using the byline Sanche de Gramont. He became an American citizen in 1977, renouncing his titles of nobility. The name he adopted as a U.S. citizen, Ted Morgan, is an anagram of de Gramont. The new name was a conscious attempt to discard his aristocratic French past, or to fit in. And he had settled on a name that conformed with the language and cultural norms of American society, a name that telephone operators and desk clerks would hear without flinching, Ted Morgan. Now, Ted Morgan is a very interesting and influential figure who went to Yale and was part of something called the Manuscript Society there. But when we reveal his deep connections beyond the de Gramont family, it's going to be quite earth-shattering tonight. So get ready for that. One of the things I want to point out also is I've done extensive family research history on de Gramont. So all the things that I say tonight, they won't be guesses. Everything that I'm going to point out to you is easily sourced. And anytime you do histories in relation to these individuals, you're going to find them exactly where I tell you that they're going to be. So there's not going to be any guessing going on. In terms of what it all means, certainly there'll be some opinion, for sure. Let's get a little bit into Ted Morgan, shall we? Ted Morgan kind of stands out there like Tom Garden as a name. Got that vibe. Now, after his father's death in a training flight, Morgan led two parallel lives. So his father dies, and suddenly he's leading two lives. He attended Yale University, where he's a member of Manuscript Society. Manuscript Society interacts and is like the lesser level of Skull and Bones, but he has a very important relative inside of Skull and Bones. He was drafted into the French Army, where he served 2 years from 1955 to 1957 during the Algerian War. The French-Algerian War, remember, there was a huge wave that comes out of this where the Central Intelligence Agency tries to assassinate President Charles de Gaulle in France long before, or a little while before the Kennedy assassination. And many of those players that were involved with setting this up become suspect, like Allen Dulles in the Kennedy assassination. Right off the bat, I want you to know that Ted Morgan, although ostensibly a military journalist and author who writes books about FDR and Winston Churchill, is a deep, deep, deep intelligence operator. And I think that they probably felt they could trust him because of his family history. Also, I want you to know that in his own words, he killed someone with his bare hands while he was in this colonial infantry because he was trying to get information out of them. So it's quite
what kind of information?
I mean, this is quite an intelligence operative. In the 70s, he stopped using the byline Sanche de Gramont. He became an American citizen in 1977, renouncing his titles of nobility, as I stated earlier. Now, what we have with Tom Garden, then, is an anagram of an anagram of an anagram, because de Gramont is also Ted Morgan, which is also Tom Garden. Keep all that in mind. I will say that having this kind of extensive history that he does of authorship, now, if we look at his life, he actually is, I think he's close to 90 years old, and he is still active on some level, for sure. And I think that as we examine his life, we're going to see that the major links between the Hughes story and this family interest, shall we say, in the HotZone, and the kind of wider panorama of intelligence connections to this entire story just become completely off the charts by identifying our friend Ted Morgan, Tom Garden, Sanche de Gramont, all one and the same. Let's keep that in mind. And Where's it going to lead? Well, it's going to lead up to the very highest threshold of power, which is quite right along the lines of where we were expecting to go in the hot zone. But when you get there, it always is interesting when the temperature goes up. Okay, that family guide on the family group sheet, I went into these extensively because I wanted to know who was who in that family, and I wanted to know his lineage back. And one of the things I found interesting about when they were talking about the anagram of his name, they use him in a famous book about anagrams, and this is the little kind of telltale. It's called, I always look up the word, egregious, and the author's name is Nymberg. Quote, Sanche de Gramont, having fulfilled his residency for citizenship, changed his name to Ted Morgan. The anagram of de Gramont, which he chose from a list that included, among other names, O.D. Garment, Tom Danger, Rod Magnet, and R.D. Megaton. That's the one. I think that when we look at that...
Somebody's going to have a Twitter account with that name.
There's quite a few there, and it definitely helps. Now, one thing that we have to keep in mind, and I want to pull out this picture of our friend later in life. Actually,
I'm going to throw in a question right
yes.
here. KWTNR wants to know, does European nobility always interact with U.S. elites? This is a good question, what is the connection between sort of the European aristocracy and the intelligence agencies?
Well, of course, they represent power.
Money.
And, yeah, there's no question about that. It's just the level of access that they have that's surprising. That's what I would say there. There's a large, hardcore European influence peddling that goes on in America, and America also throws its weight around in Europe quite a bit, as we've seen with NATO and everything else. They like to create this idea that, hey, we're protecting you, so therefore you have to do what we say. And so I think it goes back and forth quite a bit. My own feeling is that with the kind of nationalistic impulses that we're seeing, that you're getting more into a sovereign idea country to country, and that some of the larger blocs like the EU and what they were trying to do with the North American Union idea, which is just, hey, forget about America, turn it into the North American Union, Canada, Mexico, and the United States. So you have these corporate overlords, lording over the resources. Some of that plan got stuck, and what they're doing is they're switching fast to this global control grid plan. So we're seeing an awful lot of that. But that is a good question. Absolutely, I guess, would be the answer. Let's take a quick look at the Gramont and see where he came from, and then come back to our friend. And I'll remind you, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're on X Series episode 65, and this is Who is Tom Garden? Well, we just have introduced you now to who Tom Garden is, and I'm going to tell you why, as we go deeper here, his identity is so important. Yeah, quite fascinating indeed. This is another shot of de Gramont before he was Ted Morgan, and this is him writing books like The Secret War, which this is about 1961. And he's basically peddling his intelligence knowledge, really showing those movers and shakers out there that he understands this and understands that. And he, being in the middle on that French side during the French-Algerian wars, and also some of the dicier things that he when he was in the Congo doing these missions, and as a military journalist, part of his background sounds an awful lot like Ernest Hemingway. As a matter of fact, when we think about his intelligence work, originally, of course, Hemingway went in as a military journalist. That's how he got involved with all this, and he was involved with those wars. This is an older Gramont, now under the name Ted Morgan, coming out and talking about...
He looks horrified at the things he's seen. And
What I think is he seems poorly disguised. This is a guy who should be in his French aristocracy look. Instead, he's playing it down like an American. And I also feel
kind of a rumpled American.
no, yeah,
Right?
and I do actually agree with you though. But I mean, I say poorly disguised, yes, but also somewhat freaked out at what he knows. No question about it. And I would also say that when it comes to Morgan, here he is doing his big overviews on figures like Howard Hughes and figures like FDR and Winston Churchill. So he's taking this real kind of traditional route. But in the background, if you look at his books as Gramont, they're all about French kings, French nobility, secret wars, all the rest of it. Quite an interesting player. The question is, how does this interface? How does his work as Ted Morgan, who does he represent? And how does the French nobility aspect tie in to this figure? And what he's there for and his motivations. He's a major player, and when he's so major and his connections so off the charts that, when I put out that we're changing history this week, we're putting this on the record, and it is going to shake up a lot. All right, this is the Gramont. This is their crest, which is basically this weird blue savage tiger. Olivia, like this one?
Wow.
He's coming at you.
Blue.
Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah, and not very pleasant. Not very pleasant by any stretch of the imagination. Fierce.
Fearsome.
Absolutely. Their original crest does have the X steganography right in the heart of it, as we can find from one of their original monarchs here. That's the Marchat de Gramont. And they have been, there are books written about their rise to power from 1570 to 1680. And by the time of the French Revolution, actually, they're flying high and they're in the court with Marie Antoinette and all the rest of it. One of the interesting kind of Gramonts was a very close friend of Marie Antoinette. And she is the Duchess de Gramont Caderousse, and her real name was Marie Gabriel, and she became a very important figure in all this. Something that happened during the French Revolution to the Gramonts is some of them, and it's believed for the purposes of escaping, just added an M to their name so that Gramont became Grammont. And there's a lot of very confusing records in relation to this. But I think the Countess is a very important place for us to stop. She did survive the French Revolution, but she was very close friends with Marie Antoinette. And as a matter of fact, through their whole line, they will keep that name Marie Antoinette alive. So we're looking at the French nobility aspect related to that royalty, which was thrown out by the peasants. A couple of quick things about Marie Gabrielle de Gramont. She basically, what I found interesting also, and there's a couple of members in the audience who really find this fascinating, but this painting of her is on display out there in Kansas City, which is quite interesting considering the connections around Missouri that we've talked about. This is Marie Antoinette Virginie de Gramont, and this is where they've kept the name alive. This is later, though, like 1898. I think she was born then, and she's also a very kind of compelling figure. The French nobility aspect of the de Gramonts is very, they're so deep rooted in that, and they have dukedoms that are named after all of their royalties. They are one of the biggest players in French royalty, period. So we have their kind of modern representative calling himself Ted Morgan, ditching all his titles and inserting himself into American culture in the 70s, after being a major player overseas for Central Intelligence and beyond. This is a very important figure in our story, and the Tom Garden aspect and how Hughes, in Clifford Irving's biography, is using the anagram of Ted Morgan Gramont's name, and we have a triple anagram going on, is going to get us pretty far. When we get into Lindbergh, we're going to find another interesting pseudonym that's also going to shake things up a little bit. So anyway, I'm going to grab a little more of our friend de Gramont. What have you got, Miss Olivia?
So Nicholas Carupus wants to know, Gramont, the French connection with the CIA?
Oh, fascinating. Well, this has to be looked into because there are so many aspects about the heroin running that was coming out of France and how it flooded over to America. And what's interesting when you look at that just briefly is that the drug trafficking in the 40s and 50s was very different than what we got in the 60s and 70s. There was kind of an exemption for America in those days, and so drug trafficking into the country was very frowned upon. But something happened with the intelligence agencies. They realized that their power base grew the more that they allowed those things to happen, and that what we had done ostensibly to other cultures in importing the drugs and creating those profit margins for these companies, now they were turning that around on our own citizens. So this is the nature of what happened, and that's where the whole French connection comes from, which was the major drug running that was going on. And some of that activity was so powerful that it was related to the fact, as I mentioned earlier about Charles de Gaulle, who was leading France, that these coups that were happening was basically the Central Intelligence Agency trying to remove these people to get them out of the way as obstacles so that they could run their global business. Remember this about the Central Intelligence Agency. Their core members and the people who founded it were all Wall Street lawyers. This was not a military outfit in its inception. It was something to represent business interests. And Harry Truman, when he got in and signed the National Security Act in 1947, regretted it because he said that he thought he was setting up something where the president would get all this intelligence. Instead, these other groups inside the Central Intelligence Agency would go out, gather information, and make it all good for their friends inside of this corporate structure. So they're a corporate wing. They're an extra constitutional wing, the Central Intelligence Agency. This is the thing that Kennedy tried to move forward. And he said, well, they shouldn't be running the foreign policy of the United States around the world and making decisions willy-nilly without the president's approval, etc. We saw recently when Trump got in, for example, so part of that process activated again because they thought, well, we don't have total control over this guy, unlike people like Obama. And, Trump, like him or not, he was not very friendly to the intelligence agencies when he came in, and they set about to remove him. So we have seen that before. They've tried to remove other presidents, and they have, Kennedy and Nixon, and certainly the October surprise with Jimmy Carter and Bush and all the rest of that. So we have seen them incredibly active on that side of it. So that's a great point about the French connection. We have to remember that as we look back at this family, Gramont, it's a very modern situation, but we need their roots. We need to understand what took place there, to understand where they're coming from. How do those elites work? And not just as a, hey, look at those elites, we hate those elites. Isn't it nice that we can, sort of have our 2 minutes hate and be done with it? It's very different. If we can understand where they're coming from, first of all, it gives us a much better shot at dealing with them. Second of all, maybe there's a possibility that if they think that we know what they're up to, that they can't get away with it, and that they'll stop pursuing particular lines. This is the important thing about public awareness in general, I would say. Wow, fantastic questions, and we have a great crowd tonight. Tonight is X Series episode 65. I just saw Gigi Young out there. Yeah, I have to say, when I put up, I would love the next time I put up that family crest for Gigi to take a look at that, because whoa, is that a fearsome crest, and she is so good at analyzing those types of things. Absolutely fascinating.
Herzenstern would like to
Yes.
know, do you know which area of France Count Morgan was from?
Well, I'm going to read actually, because it's very fascinating that there's a big crisscross going on with Saint Germain, which is what I'm going to come to as well. So I'm going to read that specifically, that aspect of it. but there's no question that their family lineage now is over 500 years of royalty. So let's keep that in mind. They are the major players in on the French royal field, as it were. And we may end up doing just a separate episode on the Gramonts, but there's no question about it. They are, with that, kind of aspect. I think what's interesting too is that he's born in Geneva. So let's put that together. Now, an interesting thing that we're going to pivot to is there's a huge Greek aspect to this. And we got into, and we touched on briefly the Onassis part, which is very interesting. And Onassis really, in becoming this kind of global shipper, I mean, this is somebody who was well known as a drug runner and really a smuggler for South America. And he became such a big, major power player. And of course, he married Jacqueline Kennedy, and he had some tragedies, like his son dying in a plane crash. But we start to get a picture of this Greek power and Greek wealth because it comes up in this story also in a powerful way. I'm going to introduce you to some relatives of Tom Garden, aka Sanche de Gramont, aka Ted Morgan. And of course, when we think about his connection to Yale, we start to get some ideas about our friend. A couple of things, which is he wrote a book called On Becoming American, which was this really kind of flat book that was just like, oh, why I wanted to be American. And, I didn't get medical care when I was a military serviceman, so I decided to strip all my French titles 15 years later for an incident that happened in 1962. So a lot of real big inconsistencies like that. It would be hard to call him, so there's kind of an overview on his book here. So I'm just going to read a little tiny bit of that. Ted Morgan is not your usual immigrant. Born 45 years ago in Switzerland and christened Sanche de Gramont, he grew up with just enough of the advantages to realize what a disadvantage they could be. This is the line that they put out with him, which is very effective, I think. Already a count and a scion of one of France's oldest aristocratic family, he could have taken for himself the free-floating family title Prince de Badache, gone to Palm Springs, put his title up at the Windows auction, and settled back into a life of uselessness. Well, this is pretty harsh, actually, think about it. Instead, Comte de Gramont took stock of his experiences as a diplomat's brat in Washington, where he once attended a birthday party at the White House presided over by Eleanor Roosevelt. This is really weird, too, because there is this whole connection with him and the Roosevelts. As an undergraduate at Yale University, where he helped pioneer the sport of night climbing such structures as the George Washington Bridge. Okay, they're just trying to make him sound like a zany college kid. He found that his encounters with America compared favorably with an interlude as a de Gramont among the aristocrats of Paris. Watch the line closely. Quote, "There I was like an actor who knows his lines but feels miscast. This is the way I feel about him when he's shoved into this position of becoming an American journalist after being French royalty and a CIA player." So I think that this is a crucial kind of thing for us to keep in mind. Now, he actually talks about the name Ted Morgan here, which I think is important. And I looked at this anagram pyramid that he put up, where he put those names there and showed how he took the letters out to do this. It's quite interesting. But anyway, he says in 1973 he moved from Tangiers to New York City with his American wife, the poet Nancy Ryan, and their son and daughter. He applied for citizenship, fulfilled his residency requirement, changed his name to Ted Morgan, the anagram of de Gramont, which he chose from a list that included all those names I mentioned, like Rod Magnet. He said he liked Ted Morgan because it seemed forthright, practical, incisive, and balanced. It also was an anagram of Tom Garden. They left that out. Promised the judge who presided at his naturalization that he would renounce his title of count and become an American. Aha. So he goes on to, sort of talk about his heroes and lists Hemingway. Now, he also has this incredible sort of background with Africa, and I could get extensively into this. But basically, he's involved in the Congo as a military journalist, but he gets caught up in a lot of the kind of little brush wars that are going on there. So this is a guy who knows his way around intelligence and the military extremely well. Now, the book itself, On Becoming an American by Ted Morgan, it has to be something worth looking into. Highly recommend it, even though on the official side, it's giving us the kind of flat podunk story. Now, I want to introduce you to his cousin. And this is where some of the Greek aspects are going to come in. This is John Negroponte. John Negroponte has held so many powerful positions in the United States government, working heavily in the hot zone in places like Honduras, and also working at the very highest levels for people like George W. Bush, and working hands one-on-one with Dick Cheney. This is Ted Morgan, aka, or I should say, de Gramont, aka Ted Morgan, Tom Garden's relative. First cousin. Let's get a little bit in here about Negroponte, because it's going to help us open up the entire situation. Negroponte served in the United States Foreign Service from 1960 to 1977. 17 years in foreign service before he becomes a big shot at the UN. In 81 to 96, he had tours of duty as United States Ambassador in Honduras and Mexico. In Mexico, you're in the hot zone with the Yucatan, and Honduras is right in Central America, surrounding the whole thing. So he knows the area quite well. He became the U.S. permanent representative under the Bush administration to the UN from 2001 to 2004. That's under W. And he was ambassador to Iraq. And also, some of his letters were released through WikiLeaks, and they are very revealing, I would say, of his character. This is a real insider, hardcore, and major Yale player as well. Ambassador to Iraq also, at the time we were taking over, so it's a very, very interesting, let's say, choice. Now, a few things about him, which is, with his access to being an ambassador to Honduras, he really can find out a lot about the shipping lanes in the hot zone. That's very significant. And also, he was overseeing this whole thing about the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and all the rest. Now, he was working then under Reagan. So this is when the CIA moved into Central America, and all these kind of bad things started to happen as a result. We have to think of Negroponte as maybe one of the biggest players in the deep state, one of the big deep state representatives. And I think when we look at him, we're looking at kind of like a Dick Cheney. He worked closely with Cheney, actually. But this is somebody on that level. He's very much in there. He's deep on the team. He's the kind of guy who's in the nuclear bunker, waiting for the nuclear storm to pass. And I also want to point out about him that his brother is going to become very important in this, because his brother is the founder of the MIT Media Lab, which is only about 10 minutes from here. And he's such an important player as well, because this is going to take us deep, deep, deep into the hot zone, because his brother, George Negroponte, I'm sorry, Michael Negroponte, the other one's George, they have some very, very interesting kind of, let's say, backgrounds. One's in Hollywood, and one is an artist, and the other one at the MIT Media Lab is Nicholas Negroponte. Now, there's nothing wrong with being the president of the MIT Media Lab and all these positions that he served. It's the level of connection I want to point out here. Now, he came under controversy recently, that is the brother, Nicholas Negroponte, because he took a great deal of money from our friend Epstein. Epstein there, deep, deep, deep hanging out on Epstein Island. And the headline was, MIT Media Lab co-founder defends decision to take Jeffrey Epstein money, which is a very unusual thing to do under these circumstances, I would say. You would think, being part of MIT, he would just return the money, considering the kind of dark ways that Epstein got it. But no, they're calling him an embattled leader now because they didn't give the money back. Look, MIT has so much money. It is literally the repository of Silicon Valley's incredible wealth. And there is no reason for them to hang on to, $1 million of Epstein money. So it's a representative thing, saying I'm not going to give the money back.
They think that the negative PR backlash.
It'll start, yes.
Well, no, they're just not concerned.
It'll blow over.
It'll blow over. People have a short attention span, and they get to keep the money, and no harm, no foul.
Yes,
right?
Yeah.
They're
absolutely.
betting on that.
Well, when we think about his brother now working for W in the hot zone, and then for the UN, and then as director of national intelligence, these are very, very hardcore positions. You need the people that you will trust. The fact that he's Ted Morgan's cousin is very crucial as well. That is Nicholas Negroponte, the Media Lab president, and he still hasn't given the money back. Now, it's such an unpopular position that you have to wonder about this guy and where they're going with this. But anyway, so be it. Now, we do have him as Yale Skull and Bones. We have his cousin as the Manuscript Society at Yale. Those two interact. This is how I'm sure we got Sanche into Yale. So as we go deeper and look at Negroponte's connections with the CIA and his positions in Central America, we can see now there's a perfect vista here about these forces and how they grew up on the CIA platform there in the hot zone. And here's how it works. What we do is we take Ernest Hemingway's work in Bimini and Cuba, and how the CIA was hounding him, and how his own son became something of a watchdog on him as a CIA agent. Hemingway, of course, enjoyed it down there, but he spent a good deal of time, as we know, in Bimini, because it was related to the Edgar Cayce searching for these ruins off of Bimini, and also all this time in Cuba, developing these things for this vault, which I believe was footage of the underwater ruins, because over and over again his boats would go up and down the coast there, and they could not figure out what he was looking for because he wasn't fishing. So when we look at it that way, we have to draw it back in, and we have to say at a certain point the Hemingway family gets pressurized and they force Ernest's suicide. What he's left behind in Cuba, the CIA can't get at. And there's a national security memo where Kennedy talks to his CIA director and Robert Kennedy about how they can go in there and get it without setting off World War III, just to go into Hemingway's villa. It's a national security document released in 2015. There's no disputing it. So what was it? What was in Hemingway's villa that they wanted so badly that they would risk this national security incident? Well, eventually, that vault, or aspects of it, came over here, smuggled on a shrimp boat with Mary Hemingway, and was donated to the Kennedy Library. As we've gone into this, the Kennedy Library will do these incredible things about Hemingway with all his papers and all the rest. Now, there's an assistant to Mary Hemingway, who's Hemingway's widow, who went on record saying, well, actually, that wasn't the part that they gave to the Kennedy Library. It was in a bank vault in Manhattan. So when we track it at that point, we can see these developments in the hot zone. If we move it up, if we fast forward a little bit to Howard Hughes in the Bahamas, and that he's leasing these islands, and that they are looking for these ruins and positioning themselves there, and then the CIA is hiring him to create the Glomar Explorer with this incredible claw that can go underwater and pick things up, and that they're deploying this around 1970. And then, right at that juncture, we have the Clifford Irving biography. And when that biography comes out, all hell breaks loose because it's X-Share, the group that's trying to move the technology and the information out to the public, challenging X-Protect, which is the CIA holding this weird puppet version of Hughes, who comes out and does a press conference by phone, which, that could be anybody, let's face it. The fact that they allowed that in 1972 is kind of embarrassing, but that's how things were back then. So that gives us a panorama coming into that period of what was happening and how we get to Tom Garden. But once we have Tom Garden, now we can move to Tom Morgan, who is identified in Clifford Irving's biography. My research is that the name Tom Garden is an anagram of an anagram, and that what we're dealing with is the French nobility working through intelligence. It's the same French sources that were working on de Gaulle with the CIA. In that they, by the time you get to the early 70s, this is their modus operandi, which is they have to move into these power positions. Now remember, Negroponte, in running the Media Lab, they practically invent the internet. So they moved into a different power position. And then when we look at how they operate in the hot zone, they have problems down there because they have Cuba, which they really can't overthrow, and they can't really get at their ruins. So we're starting to see a sort of a much larger picture. And I know that it takes a few episodes in, if you really are following the series, to understand the Hemingway aspect working against these intelligence forces, the Hughes aspect getting manipulated and turning into a puppet of those forces, and then the appearance of this French nobility, kind of leading us on as we go. Once we get into Negroponte, we're starting to see the Greek shipping aspect. That's going to come into this story. So the hot zone is, remember, a confluence of players. And what they're engaged in, you could call it geopolitics on one level. But the aspect that I think isn't featured anywhere and which we've decided to focus on has to do with land rising off the East Coast. And it has to do with the mystery school aspects and the information that Cayce gave us in relation to Bimini. What Cayce said was that it was the first wave of the rising of these Atlantean ruins was going to take place at Bimini, but he called it the first wave. So that's the key place. That's where we have access to the Bimini Road. So we're starting to get a picture here of all these players positioning themselves over the decades, getting ready for this to happen. That's where we are. Now, I have more to get into in relation to Lindbergh, but I'm going to turn it over to you, Miss Olivia, for a moment.
Najat was asking any connection to the J.P. Morgan family as well. And Nicholas Krupus wanted to know, why would a French nobleman choose a German surname?
Oh, that's good. That's a really good point. Yeah, I don't buy the fact that why he chose that name. Certainly not. But it's very, to me, what we're looking at is that internecine warfare that goes on. And really, Irving's autobiography calling out the fake Hughes, and then the fake Hughes showing up to sue him, and then the courts allowing it, saying, we don't need to see Hughes, he can just do it by phone, means the CIA wins in that exchange. But I also think that they said to him, if you kind of call off the con, we'll just give you a slap on the wrist and you'll go on, you'll be famous. So I don't think that I think that the offer originally represented some kind of movement, because when you look at the story, it's very unusual about Irving. And we're going to talk a little more about him. Clifford Irving was already an accomplished author, and that's why he was so well trusted to do the Autobiography of Hughes. And when we look at Hughes, he was acting like such a mystery and hadn't been seen in public so long that there were these videotapes of this guy going around, and he was wrapped up like a mummy, and that was supposed to be Hughes. It was the most absurd thing you've ever seen. So I think when we look at it, we have to...
You don't have a picture of that? That was great.
That was great. No,
it reminded me of those old Invisible Man movies.
Yes.
It was crazy.
Yes. There's no question about it. Well, and also, if you think about it, like if that happened now, they'd be so crazy to find out who the real person was. You know what I mean? Because we're so hyped about doubles and everything else. So it was so easy for them just to get away with this phony version of Hughes. But why? Well, with the largest intelligence network in the world, along with the largest budget in the world, that's black budget because you're just utilizing this guy's as the richest man in the world, it makes sense. I mean, it's more of the power broker aspect, yes.
Gigi says anagrams keep the name numerology.
Right. Yeah, excellent point. Excellent point. I think that we're, we've really come into a place of being able to identify some of these figures, and it gets weird because then you're really over the target and you're starting to see what they see, which is always quite unusual because they think that they're keeping this big secret and that, people wouldn't really catch on. And that if you have people like Branson or if you have these other people searching in the hot zone, that they could just say, oh, it's an ocean thing, or we're looking for Spanish galleons or whatever it is. But land is rising off the East Coast, and the mystery school legacy for this is that the land that's rising is associated with ruins that represent this older civilization. That's the real shift. That's the real breakthrough for consciousness. I know that we're looking for a lot of disclosure in relation to the UFO field, etc. But when you get right down to it, the idea that we had a civilization that was just as advanced or more advanced than the one that we have now is definitely an earthquake in our consciousness. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is episode X65. Who is Tom Garden? We've told you tonight that Tom Garden is Tom Morgan, and that Tom Morgan is Sanche de Gramont, and that de Gramont represents a power arm going all the way back previous to the French Revolution. So we're getting pretty deep in the thick of it when his cousin is Negroponte, who is John Negroponte, who served at the highest levels of government working with the Bush administration, and before that for the Reagan administration, controlling that area of the hot zone. So, I think what we have there and what we're trying to kind of unwind, and with the MIT Media Lab professor and his association with Epstein taking all this money, this is another aspect of it because Epstein and his island are in this area. They're in the range of this area. And, of course, there's so many kind of, welcome to the pleasure dome, right? When you go down into that area, it's kind of lawless, all these things and all the rest of it. So it's ideal, yes. But let's look at it a little bit deeper. When you had Howard Hughes down there, well, Howard Hughes was also in Bimini. He spent a great deal of time in Bimini. Who else spent time in Bimini? Richard Nixon, President Richard Nixon. His financier, B.B. Rebozo. Then we have Martin Luther King in Bimini, and we have the Kennedys associated with Bimini. And we have the love of Jackie's life for the second part of her life starting a charity in Bimini and them cruising around Bimini. And you have pictures of JFK Jr. in Bimini and recently RFK Jr. in Bimini. So there's something about Bimini. I mean, yes, it's a great resort, but there's so many islands there for these people to be, to have such history with it. It's a small set of islands, and it's fantastic, and it is beautiful, but it's about 7 miles. How are you getting the world's biggest players there? Obviously, it relates to this area and what they know about it and how it's the first place. In the mystery school tradition, that's the first place to rise. There's no question for me when I'm looking at the information relating to Bimini and the fact that Cayce had identified it and that Hemingway lived there, and that his brother was there looking for this healing well, that we start to get a picture there of what is really going on in the hot zone. This is the crucial information. The shift here on the history side is that we're looking at people and players that weren't on the record in relation to the hot zone. Now they are. Now we know who some of the players are. And the shift in history when we find Ted Morgan brings us closer, a lot closer, to who are the power players involved. And we can see in the case of Morgan, they go all the way back before the French Revolution on the French royalty side. So we're in a very interesting position here. And I want to remind everyone to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter now, because with all the social media things that are going on, these platforms becoming very dynamic, and kind of, it's a little bit of a Wild West show. We don't know what's going to happen or who they're going to take off next. But in any case, if we have that pipeline together with each other, it's going to make a whole heck of a lot more sense. I want to bring up something secondary in relation to Tom Garden, which I found kind of fascinating. And I was speaking with a British viewer who was telling me about a very famous children's book, and I appreciate her tipping me off about this book, actually.
This is a fantastic tip.
It's quite extraordinary, and I have to say people were really exceptionally on it. And when we get to the name around Lucky Lindy too, which is Carew Kent, remind me to mention that before we're done. That's an interesting pseudonym that Lindbergh was using, so we need to touch on that.
God,
also.
these pseudonyms.
Yeah, the pseudonyms really do. They run the show. One thing I want to also tie in here, which is when we look at some of the de Gramont's activities, if you go deep enough, you will find a publisher for a book called The Mystery of the West, Atlantis in Europe, which is down here, it's Dumstil de Gramont, and he is the publisher of the book, and the book is by Tajna Zapata, and it's called The Mystery of the West, Atlantis, Europe. So we have the de Gramonts directly involved in publishing work about the mysteries of Atlantis. That gives us a little heads up. Now, this is pretty deep in their family line. I'll tell you something real funny turnaround on all this, which is the American version of this book was published by the Rudolf Steiner Foundation in 1971. Think about that, it's quite remarkable. So the minute Steiner showed up, I was like, all bets are off. But I do find it interesting that, it's almost like the mystery schools present the information, and then all these French nobilities and, all the French royalty and all the nobles understand these things, and that's why you hear ripples of it in their work. But it's the mystery schools that bring it all public in the 18th century and into the 19th century. Once you get to the mid-19th century, then we've got theosophy, then we have anthroposophy. Follow up to that is the Cayce work. What are they talking about? Atlantis, lost civilizations. Why? Why? Why do they make it such a huge emphasis? Because this is the period getting set up in our consciousness for rediscovery of what that is. And they spend a great deal of time discussing Atlantis, its incredible technology, its incredible destruction. So that when we get around people like Howard Hughes, for example, and he's building this incredible technology, and he is becoming part of Hughes Aerospace, that's going to be a controlling piece of this whole space control grid that they're, like the space fence and all the rest of it, and the secret space program. So therefore, these people are reenacting roles from an earlier period of time when the echo is from those legends that, human beings were like gods and they had these great abilities. Well, they had the ability to use that technology then, and it was a finer interaction with it because it was consciousness-based. And apparently, in something that I describe as apotheum and in a reality distortion event, everything sank. I mean, that's the story from Plato. It's a tale. It's a piece of history directly from the priests of Egypt. That's where Plato gets it directly through a relative from the priests in Egypt. So they had the records, as we know from the Cayce readings. So therefore, that's just history. And therefore, when we get that history, our own consciousness about what we are and what we're doing changes dramatically. This is the shift, and this is the thing that those people want to be ahead of the curve on. Okay, so we'll take some of your questions here, Miss Olivia. I'll let you jump in here, but I'm gonna, in the middle of the question section, I'll do the Lucky Lindy and Charles Lindbergh stuff. And I'm gonna do a complete episode on Lindbergh, but I'm going to give you kind of a preview of that here. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program X65. Who is Tom Garden? Tom Garden is Ted Morgan, who is Sanche de Gramont, and Miss Olivia.
Okay, so first up, prognosis. They can't all be there just for the ruins. Maybe it happens to also be a headquarters for a mystery school?
Oh, well, I mean, there's all kinds of traditional reasons to be there. I mean, from drug running to geopolitics and all the rest of it. I would say that Autech, which operates, by the way, off Andros Island, and Andros is another place where they've identified the people who've done diving. There's something called the Andros Platform, which is another underwater ruins site. And it's very close. It's like a totally short distance from Bimini. So for Autech to be set up there, and for their, Autech is basically the underwater Area 51. It's a super secret underwater military base. So they are there for a variety of reasons, but there's something about the area, and I believed that if you look at the Cayce readings carefully and you read the Steiner work, that the area itself was disturbed by what the Atlanteans did and this apotheum effect that was created. And the apotheum effect works kind of like the UFO file, because when it shows up, power doesn't work normally. Physical laws don't translate the same way. People walk through walls and things like that. So when we look at those reality distortion effects, whenever you get into the Bermuda Triangle and that whole end of things, you hear story after story about that. So there's no doubt in my mind that there's something about that region that has these unusual magnetic qualities. And we've seen that even Lindbergh, when he's in the Bermuda Triangle, he gives a whole thing about his compass is spinning. He doesn't know what to do. I do feel that when we get our hands, when we're looking at these areas, we're starting to get a handle on a totally different kind of physics. And you could call it sort of like a runaway physics, or I'd just call it apotheum, which is what the mystery schools originally referred to it. That term captures this idea, and it captures the same thing that happens when we have these UFO sightings over nuclear bases and the bases shut off. It's because whatever field it brings in with it distorts the reality, so those normal physical reality doesn't operate anymore. And I thought this is really weird. Joseph Farrell had told me a story once about how the astronauts, when they went to the moon, one of the things that they didn't want to talk about is that they saw deceased relatives there. That it was much clearer for them to do this. This is really amazing stuff, but this goes along with that. When you get away from the physical effects of the Earth, things change. Your consciousness lives. You're capable of so many more things. So yes, there's a physical, political reason for these players to be there, but they are, there's no question that the ruins and the land rising, because remember, when the land rises, if it's in international waters, it's completely sovereign. So it's actually a new nation. So they're aware of these things, just as I'm telling you about them. They know about them. Keep that in mind. Yes.
Okay, Treebeard the Ent has great questions tonight. Was there any indication of time travel experimentation linked to Howard Hughes? And did he leave any time capsules?
Well, with Hughes, so much of his stuff was taken over, in essence, that it's tough to say who would have his time capsules. I will say this about him and time, though, which is in this unusual book that was referred to me by this British viewer, Tom in the Midnight Garden, it has some very, very unusual time slip things. The book was written in the 50s, and it's set up in this whole kind of Victorian reality. And what happens is he basically keeps landing, this boy keeps landing at 13 o'clock, and he's meeting all these people at 13 o'clock, and, they're getting older and stuff, and he's staying the same age. And the writer of the book, Philippa Pierce, is also quite interesting because she is an OBE, and she worked at Downing Street at the Prime Minister's office. So she was really this kind of power player with access to a lot of information. And I found the Tom in the Midnight Garden book was an interesting twist. The way it relates to Hughes is very unusual because I did a lot of research on the book. And what I found was actually quite unusual. What happened was, when I looked it up, I found that there was another version of this book, and it was a graphic novel. And that the graphic novel, I said, okay, this is an interesting thing. I'll look at the graphic novel and all the information around that. Well, the graphic novel was written by Howard Hughes. But it was written in the year 2000, so it's someone using the pseudonym Howard Hughes for this book, Tom in the Midnight Garden, which is all about time slips. So this was an interesting little bit of research. And so, yes, time travel, I have no doubt a guy like Hughes was deeply involved in looking for that. And listen, with his access to government, he was best friends with Richard Nixon. And he loaned now $250,000 in the 50s to Nixon's brother to start a chain of fast food restaurants. And this is the kind of power that Hughes had. I mean, he was really deep in this system, and the control mechanism around him. It's very interesting. After the Kennedy assassination, one of the first things that Robert Kennedy said was that I should have been watching the Hughes organization, because he knew about the deep-seated connection with the CIA there. So that gives you some idea of what they were playing with, no doubt about it. Yes, Ms. Olivia.
Okay, so Kelvin DeHootie wants to know if, and many other people do as well, if Lenin and others were buying lots around Bimini, who was selling the lots? Have you investigated this?
Yeah, there's lots of different ways to look at this. I mean, when you go to purchase an island, for example, there's so many different authorities that you can deal with. And we also, one of the things that's interesting about Ghislaine Maxwell, going back to the Epstein thing, is that she was working with this nonprofit that was all about saving the oceans and stuff. And the idea was to buy up certain parts of the ocean so it wouldn't get overfished or whatever. But this is, in my mind, is more of this cover for trying to be there at the right place at the right time. Now, I want to point one other thing out in relation to land rising. A lot of people say, well, water's rising off the East Coast, right? That's the scientific thing. In 50 years, DC should be underwater. Those studies can change pretty quickly depending on the political climate. My feeling is this, that if you look at it, there is land rising, and they do point it out, and I've shown several examples in this program of islands that thrust up out of underwater. So it has to do with volcanic activity. Now, there are some very interesting researchers around Bimini who feel that there's massive volcanic activity beneath Bimini that is pushing the area up. So even though you get like a rising water thing with environmental conditions, that's fine, but that has nothing to do, it's not a gradual process. This stuff just thrusts up after a period of time. So if it is volcanic, it spews forth. And that's the kind of thing that we'd be looking for. Now, if land rises off the East Coast, it's going to be a major political thing, and this could be exactly what we're moving into. That would be a great explanation. Yes.
I have a great question. Nicholas Krupis, you're on fire tonight. Was Jackie Gleason also an investor in Bimini ocean lots? Fantastic question.
Look, we're gonna go into the hot zone with Jackie. I haven't run across Jackie, but Jackie took a lot of vacations with Nixon, including the one in Florida where at Homestead Air Force Base he showed him dead aliens, apparently. I've always believed that story because the ex-wife told it, and this is not one of those.
Well, he couldn't eat afterwards.
He couldn't eat.
He was so
That's
horrified.
tough too
Yeah.
for a guy like Gleason. The other thing is, when I think about Nixon's character, we know how close he was to the UFO file. When I really think about Nixon, he is the kind of guy who would like to show off, and he had this propensity for making himself a big shot because he had an unusual kind of shut-in personality, even though he was president.
He was horribly insecure.
Yes. He wanted to
Probably
be.
on the spectrum.
Oh, no question. Well, because he's brilliant. There's no question
Mhm.
about it.
But socially horribly uncomfortable. Uncomfortable in his own skin.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's his great. This is a tricky thing about him because he had the ability to be absolutely fantastic because he knew, they say he was the hardest working president out of them all. But he had this kind of trapdoor mechanism, and so he was easily manipulated, and even manipulated out of office, as it turns out. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Treebeard again. Why didn't Fidel Castro just loot the hot zone with the help of the USSR?
He tried. Look, this is what Zalitsky's work was all about. And if you really go back to Polina Zalitsky's work, you will see Castro gets her back after she defects, because she was in Cuba in the 60s for a decade. And she had come there as part of the Soviet program. And she was doing, kind of oceanographic work, but measuring currents and things like that. But by the time you get to 1999, Castro gives her the cover line, which is, I want you to search for Spanish galleons. What it is he wants a qualified person down there doing it. He hires her company, even though she's defected once from Cuba to Canada. And she finds those ruins. I mean, it's the most undeniable underwater footage of all. And I have to say, it's a little bit tough when you get around Atlantis researchers because Zalitsky's not a very public figure and they don't want to give her credit for the biggest find in history around the Atlantis thing. So they don't give her the credit, but they should. And I certainly do because Polina Zalitsky's find is the big breakthrough find along with the Bimini Wall. There's hands down, those are the two biggest finds related to Atlantis. So, it's undeniable. I do feel that the atmosphere needs to be created where people open up to Zalitsky's research, even though, look, she was bullied by the Cuban Navy eventually to get out of there, and they wanted to kind of squelch the story in the West. So all sorts of terrible things happened to her, including landing in a Mexican jail. So we have to take the Zalitsky work out of the shadows and bring it forward. We have to understand there's already a city that's been discovered off the western tip of Cuba. It's not theoretical. It's already been found. The access is the tough problem. But we do have access, as I said, to Bimini. And we have great psychics like Gigi Young that can be in Bimini and really working on these things. That's the ideal approach for a breakthrough in the hot zone, in my opinion. And I do feel that if you had a researcher like Zalitsky, a psychic like Gigi, and a real push around the research side of this, you could get right to the bottom of it in a hurry. Yes.
They're saying that you sidestepped the question about who owns the international waters to sell the land.
No, I didn't. I explained it. What happens is it's all individual because if you're dealing with the Bahamas, then you deal with the UK. If you're dealing off Florida, you deal with the US. If you're dealing in international aspects, that's a whole different thing. You have different boards. You have the UN, you have environmental. So it's not like there's one guy who's selling those lots, but there are ways and means. Look, John Lennon bought an island off of Ireland, a whole island there. And, a lot of this thing, Epstein himself bought Pedo Island, right? This is it. And so when we look at these things, yes, you can make those purchases and there are sellers, but they're also varied. It's not like you're going to go to one specific entity. I do think that when we look at the story of Ernest Hemingway's brother with New Atlantis setting up this area and searching for this area where he could set up this New Atlantis, this is a big key as to what was going on behind the scenes. And the government did give him a hard time eventually for doing this too. And I think that story is a good one to give us kind of a snapshot of what happens when somebody actually tries to do this. I think with Lennon and some of these other people, they did it more behind the scenes. They were quiet about it. And it was sort of like a quiet thing where now we have all this, people use Atlantis as a buzzword for things, but there's a real solid tradition that comes out of the Cayce work, that comes out of the mystery schools, that comes out of researchers like Egerton Sykes, who was a British intelligence officer. And he said, look, Russia is involved, Cuba is involved, the US is involved, they all want the ruins. So you can theoretically look at it and say, why would they want the ruins? I think it's obvious from the mystery school angle. They want it because Cayce talked about the Two-Eye Stone. The Two-Eye Stone is a massive power center that the Atlanteans used. They want to know how the ancients powered things, and if they did have a civilization that was comparable to ours. As fantastic as that sounds. Yes, Miss Olivia.
I'm sort of horrified. The Code channel says John Travolta has an island too. Ugh.
Oh.
I don't even want to think about it. Okay, so David Tormina says,
Yes.
DJ, what's the connection to the XPrize?
Well, that is very well timed, Mr. Tormina, who's doing great stuff on Twitter. Very interesting stuff related to X topics, and a lot of that stuff's very, very interesting. So he's David Tormina on Twitter, and I definitely recommend that. It's good kind of open source research. But to answer your question, well, it turns out that one of the founders of the XPrize is pretty interesting. The XPrize in itself represents that inside knowledge thing about, hey, the next inventor who comes forward with a good aerospace idea will promote his project, and I was reading a book about this, and one of the people related to it was talking about it, and he said, yeah, I keep waiting for the UFO guys to just float up here with the UFO technology, because we know they're out there. So they have this kind of inside joke in the XPrize. But one of the people who set it up, interestingly enough, was Charles Lindbergh's son, Eric. Now, this is going to be just a light dabble into the next episode coming up on the Hot Zone, which is about Lindbergh. This is that original vision of the XPrize, and you can see that X hovering in the middle, the X steganography representing the aerospace. And remember, in my research I've put forward in many programs, you're going to find but so far, and I'm just one researcher, over 200 versions of these X-planes. There are other people there's a fantastic book, Merlin and Moore. The book is called X-Plane Crashes, which I think is very important. This is the ultra-secretive technology when it goes wrong. Remember, the whole thing about X steganography is when the projects are related, the way that they're followed through these government agencies is they use the X as that X steganography for them, people on the inside in the know, able to follow, so that you can't sit down a bunch of CIA agents or a bunch of inside operators and say, everyone, here's the whole thing about X steganography. All you have to do is tell them, follow the X part when it comes back. When a project goes black and reemerges with an X on it, you'll know. So I followed a number of them, and I'm not in intelligence, so obviously they're able to do this. But what I found out about it, which was weirder, which is that the X steganography, which they use to move things through government agencies, they got from older mystery school traditions. They were moving secrets around with X steganography long, long before the 20th century. So it is a very interesting puzzle. When you get around the XPrize, that's those group of elites. They understand it very well, just like SpaceX and Elon Musk. They're in this position. They have access to that knowledge. They all want a bigger piece of the pie, and I don't think any one of them has the whole bit, just like with the Hot Zone. It's all a piece. But the facts of Lindbergh, the funny thing about Lindbergh is that here's a couple of interesting facts. One, when his son is kidnapped in the 30s, who does he turn to? Edgar Cayce. So when Lindbergh is getting ready for his big run across the Atlantic, where is he spending the most time? In Havana. So Lindbergh is deep, deep in the Hot Zone. And I think that when we start to really explore those connections with Lindbergh, as we're going to do, we're going to find something really fascinating, which is he's very deeply involved with the moonshot, which a lot of people probably didn't know that. One thing, I had a quote about Lindbergh. Let's get a shot of him here, because he shows up very heavily in our Hot Zone activity, and he's going to be a very special episode coming up. Truly remarkable, the Spirit of St. Louis and the strange funding around Spirit of St. Louis, as if a group was ready to unleash more advanced flight on the public, and a lot of very unusual characters. Now, interestingly enough, after he retired, he went and he spent all this time in Germany, and he actually fathered a second family that no one knew about. And they didn't know that he was Charles Lindbergh. He used the name Carew Kent, Careukent.
What a weird name.
It is, think about it.
And it's not an anagram.
It is not. It is not. Although I would like to see people, again, take a look at this name, Carew Kent, and try to figure out what its origin might be. Because you guys are doing great with that. But just to get a little quick snapshot of Lindbergh's thinking, when he's in England visiting the royal family, who are celebrating all of his great accomplishments, in Lindbergh, a biography by Leonard Mosley, there's a little snapshot of how he thinks in here. So I'll just jump in. A few days afterward, a strange thing happened. Lindbergh arrived at the castle and asked for Nicholson. This guy's going to visit. When he was shown into the study, he said in his usual straightforward way, "I've been doing a lot of study into psychic research. Would you know of a medium here or in London who we could visit so that we could attend a seance?" Nicholson regretted that such esoteric matters were outside of his ken, and Lindbergh thanked him and left. Lindbergh is very open to psychic material. When his son is kidnapped, like I said, he goes to Edgar Cayce. He's aware. He's flying over the hot zone on a regular basis, getting ready for his transatlantic flight. So when we think of Lindbergh now, I think we're thinking of him in a very different way, and that'll give you some setup for the next episode that we're going to do on the hot zone. Yes.
Robert Ayala wanted to know about Charles Lindbergh and Hughes and any intelligence connection to the kidnapping.
Oh, very interesting. If you can save that question for the next episode, you'll have a better answer, because I have a lot of things to bring out about the kidnapping, and it is unusual. One of the things that Cayce said about it, which is very strange, and on the child that they found, it's very strange. Cayce said that when they took the child, they had cut his hair and dyed it. And also, he said that Hauptmann was just kind of a hapless go-between, and that the real planners were a totally different group. The Lindbergh kidnapping is a terrible story, absolutely horrifying, but it may have been used as a tool to keep him quiet. So there's a lot about that in the episode I have coming up on him. I also want to say that we can celebrate Lindbergh as a hero for what he did. He had controversial opinions, unlike a lot of people, and he had a double life and things like that, but unbelievable, just amazing abilities, and really making a breakthrough for all of humanity with his incredible flight. Yes.
So, weren't you saying something about Lindbergh having his third eye open on his transatlantic flight?
Yes, I definitely, I think I have the quote of that here, the full quote, but in a nutshell, when he is flying the first transatlantic flight, which is an incredible event for humanity, all these things start to happen to him. And he starts to say, I am part of the entire cosmos, basically. And he starts to say how only one incarnation can't hold my entire life. I mean, really heavy, esoteric language. Then he starts hearing voices in the plane telling him how excited they are, and they're with it. It's like they're almost like ghost voices.
Like cheerleaders.
Yeah, they are. And they keep him going, because when he leaves for France, he only takes a couple of sandwiches with him. And the person who's giving him the sandwiches on this flight, they're like, "Don't you want to have more food?" And he says, if I don't make it, I won't need it. And if I get to France, then they have plenty of food there. So he has a really incredible attitude. But if you look at the plane that makes this flight, and you think about modern flight, it's extraordinary. He was able to do it. He was definitely well chosen for his part.
And he wrote this all in his memoir?
He did.
He admitted to all this.
Oh, yeah, no, he wanted to bring it across. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we will. I'll dig out the entire quote. I may have it right here. I might even read it before tonight's over. I had another shot of Cayce in his study right around the time that Lindbergh asked him to do this. And there's Casey's trying to live his life as a photographer again. No such luck. People drag him out to use his psychic ability, and but in his photography studio, unbelievable. He was also kind of untouchable. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Kontiki Man says, are there any privately owned remote sensing satellites in geosync orbit over the hot zone? Is there anyone keeping track of that?
Well, absolutely there are satellites in relation to that. I did see a NASA feed over Bimini, which is quite remarkable. They keep an eye on it on a regular basis, and they're like, oh, we're measuring currents. I'm sure they're looking for things. I'd like to think about this in relation to Gordon Cooper, who we know as the astronaut who was up there, and they came out with this treasure hunting story about his maps and stuff. I don't know about that, but I do know the idea that they sent him up on special missions to look down into the hot zone, and that he saw things there and remembered the coordinates because he had a very fast memory like that, and then in later years looked for those things. I think is absolutely fascinating, and I've looked a lot into that. There's no question NASA has so much data. They understand so much about what's going on down there. And that's probably why there are sanctions on Cuba right now. When you see these actions in the hot zone against Venezuela or Cuba, and just that intensity of trying to control the area. And I do feel that Cuba's a big piece on their map because the city is so well defined, and that Zelensky found it's so wide open as to where it was. Remember also that one of the most incredible scientists who was down there, Thomas Townsend Brown, he spent all this time where? In San Antonio, Cuba, which is that western tip, again, where Zelensky was when she found the ruins. What was he doing there? Was he working on this back there in the 50s and 60s? Because so much of his work went dark because the government basically blacked him out. So we have a lot now. We have a lot of supporting players and information for the hot zone. It's in a different place than it was even a year ago. From the time we brought out the information relating to Ernest Hemingway and the hot zone, now you have Graham Hancock's new book that he came over here, and we did the live event with him. That's America Before, about Atlantis in America, essentially, and how the DNA supports that now. That's this year. We have Andrew Collins, who wrote all about Gateway to Atlantis, Cuba and Atlantis. He was very big and did a lot of good work on that. He's putting out a new book about early human origins with Greg Little, who's also done a lot of UFO stuff for the Cayce Foundation. So there's a move there. When this information is coming forward, the timing is right. What we need is a real focus on the hot zone. And I know that we get a lot of things. I think all the other areas are important too, don't get me wrong. But I really think something in the hot zone will pay off a lot more than just fantasizing about Antarctica, which we can't get at, as a practical matter. And I will lead the expedition. Yes, I will. Okay.
Okay, so Calvin Tahuti says, unrelated, but Lindbergh's father was a senator that was against the creation of the Fed, and he died abruptly, suicided during the vote?
Wow, fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a lot of very interesting power plays with Lindbergh. The Nazis tried to recruit him, as we know, because he had the German origin also. And he also had a big, let's stay out of the wars thing, and let's not get into World War II. So he changed once we got bombed at Pearl Harbor, but really hardcore. Gigi Young sent me this one. This is great, Gigi. It was Lindbergh reaches goal at Havana. Spokesman of Pan American nations and 1,000 Cubans welcome flyer. And on the side it says, met by Hughes at field. Troops barely hold back, great crowd as flyer taxis in. That's an original headline from the New York Times in 1928. quite remarkable. So that was a great find. Nicely done. And there's more to come on that, including the name Spirit of St. Louis. It's going to be very important as we bring that in. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay,
Oh, before we go,
mhm.
go to darkjournalist.com. I'm going to actually mention the newsletter here and have you sign up for the newsletter before, just as a kind of a doubling down for the social media aspect, because with the newsletter, what you're going to get is just a lineup of the shows we have coming up for you in the fall, which are explosive. Which is why I recommend you become a subscriber. Also, get behind the show, get behind the work that we're doing here. This is the time to do it. And I think here, as we come into the fall, the lineup of the shows and the guests is something you're not going to want to miss. So make sure that you do that. Go to darkjournalist.com. Also, while you're there, sign up for the newsletter. Don't miss any of the shows and the announcement. I can tell you right now, the announcements that we're going to make in September, there's not going to be a lot of lead up for them. I'm just going to drop them in when we get them, and it's going to be important stuff, so make sure you're on the inside there. It's great to have so many people here. We're going to take a couple more questions, and as far as Lindbergh goes, I will say this, we're going to do a whole complete episode, but I wanted to tease some of that in here because that is the next leg in our Hot Zone activity. Yes.
Okay, David Tormina again. DJ, if Glomar Explorer scanned over the ruins, then those photos must exist. Any chance you think they will become public?
It's an excellent point. Look, Glomar Explorer was designed to get the truth about underwater ruins in the hot zone. That's what it was built for. Ostensibly, the official story is, oh, they did it because they wanted to pick up a nuclear sub. And guess what? The CIA's story got out to the public, and oh golly, oh gee, we just have to mothball the whole idea. It just doesn't hold up. First of all, the CIA doesn't lose secrets like that, and second, that whole thing, it's very interesting. There's an interesting comment that one of the guys who set up the TTSA and then went into the shadows was Ron Pandolfi, and he's a CIA scientist who's always been around the UFO file. It's kind of a mysterious figure. But there was someone who was in a journalistic capacity asking him questions, and when they got to Glomar Explorer, he did not want to say anything. Now look, the Cold War has been over a long time. The Soviet Union doesn't even exist. Why wouldn't you want to talk about it? It's very unusual. Because in my opinion, what they were doing was they were trying to rush the timetable. That is, instead of waiting for the land to rise, if we can just get our hands on this stuff, why bother with this, tedious thing? For all we know, a lot of AUTEC's job is really to get at the ruins and to, apprehend the technology from the Hall of Records. Yes, they have traditional roles down there, military purposes, no question. But I think when we look at organizations like AUTEC, it's the same thing. I do feel that just like the vault that was in Cuba, which I believe was for underwater photography, I think the Glomar had incredible underwater photography, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of that slipped out. So it's a great question. The Glomar Explorer is a very strange story for a lot of reasons, because its original inception is off Cuba. That's what they originally created for, and then but this cover story is that it's supposed to be in Hawaii to pick up this Russian sub, but it's stationed in the Gulf of Mexico. That ship is also leased year after year after year, all the way up to 2018 is the last one that I saw for it. So it's still around. That's how incredible it was.
Okay, Rehoboth Farm. Do you think that they used the Glomar Explorer to recover something off the bottom?
Yes, no question about it.
And that would be?
Well, I
best
think,
guess?
for all I know, it could have been, if you look at Polina Zalitsky's work and you see the pyramids, and she said that there were pyramids and sphinxes. And she also said that the pyramids, the buildings that she saw, had hieroglyphs on them. And they automatically assumed, in the interview, they said, Egyptian hieroglyphs? And she said, no, Mayan hieroglyphs. So we're dealing with that weird offshoot, which is kind of like that step there that became the culture that set up the Mayans. And It's funny because I mentioned this with Gigi before too, which is if you look into Egerton Sykes' work about Murius, it seems like there's a piece of Atlantis that survives around Bimini longer than when Atlantis goes down. There's like a piece there, and then that piece goes too. And it's interesting because if you look at there's a Cayce reading talking about someone named Iltar, and they say he set up a kind of another version with 50 of his followers who are kind of the elite builders and psychics from Atlantis, and they set up kind of another version off the tip of Yucatan, and then that one sinks with the change there. So there's evidence for a mountain chain between Cuba and the Yucatan Peninsula. So I do feel that the possibility for ruins is palpable. I do feel that they got at some of them. And what I'm wondering the most is what Cuba is doing with Zalitsky's fund, because they don't have the capabilities underwater that the United States does. And so they may be utilizing Russian technology to get it. That could be part of the problem with why they're being sanctioned so hard. When you see the action in the hot zone, remember the traditional story and then think of the hot zone ruins and the mystery schools and Cayce and what he left. Look, Cayce left the prediction. He first mentioned Bimini in 26. And then in 43, he mentions that it's going to rise. Parts of the temple will rise in 68. So 26 to 43, that's 17 years later. It's on the record for a reason. It's not random with Cayce that information is out there. That source put out that the first wave of the land rising would happen off the coast of Bimini, and that's what we see. Yes.
Okay, so Mirror 13.
Olivia, by the way, it's great to have Olivia back because she's so opening up the floor to the best questions.
It's fun.
Yes.
Okay, Mirror 13.
Nice round of applause for Olivia. Unbelievable.
Thank you. Do you believe some group has found one of or the two-eye stone? I'm going to say I think they have, personally.
Wow. Yeah. Here's the thing that's kind of interesting. Cayce mentions the two-eye stone multiple times. And he says that they created a power station with it, and then he describes what it was kept in. And it was kept in a building that they could roll the dome back, and then it could work off the stars at night and the sun rays during the day. And it was a power center. Now, originally, the Atlanteans had used it to interact with spiritual forces, and eventually, that's the Amelius group. The Belial group comes in and uses it to dominate, basically like atomic power, and they dominate other groups. So, I think the best way to look at it is that technology was so powerful and ran the planet at a certain point, and there are echoes of it all the way to the Great Pyramid and all the rest. Now, he said specifically that the manner of construction of the two-eye stone was in those three places, Yucatan, Bimini, and under the paw of the Sphinx. So I believe that it's a pretty big geopolitical football, because we have to remember that it's on record, declassified, that the CIA in 1964 did a study on whether there was a hall of records under the foot of the Sphinx based on the Cayce readings. Well, are they just going to do that randomly? I mean, they're checking it out.
Hold on a second, I just caught that out of the corner of my ear. What did you just say?
In 1964, the CIA searched, they did an entire study of whether there was a hall of records under the Sphinx. And
I did not know that.
Based on the Cayce readings.
Wow, okay.
It's a fact.
How did they make that public?
Well, it was declassified as part of a series of people getting requests for their PSI program and other things. And then they had a whole thing about searching for Noah's Ark, and this is part of the archaeological wars aspect we have to get on board with, because archaeology is fun, and Göbekli Tepe is fun and all the rest, but it has a place in the way that these things play out, and I think that we need to look at it in a different way, which is we're getting these ideas on one hand about the larger picture of humanity and history, and the way that story is played out and controlled is absolutely important. So yeah, when you get into an intelligence agency, that's what they do, they spin. But I think it's a good point that the two eye stones is the kind of the crown jewel in the whole thing, because for them, hearing from Cayce in the mystery schools about what it can do, boy, would they love to get their hands on it. So, do I think they have it already? I think that they've made a really strong run at finding it.
I'm gonna say I honestly find myself much more psychic when Gigi's in the chat.
Oh, yes.
And I'm just listening to my own intuition on this one. I think they have.
Oh, boy.
I do, in a very kind of Indiana Jones sort of way, and they are really trying to see how that thing works.
I remember, it's funny with Gigi, right, Gigi, it's like someone who raises the IQ points in the chat. She raises the psychic points.
Absolutely.
The psychic Q. Well, I'd say this, that I think one thing that she caught a glimpse of is that they had found some things that they were experimenting with, and they didn't know how to control the experiments. That's very interesting tuning in, and I think it's the kind of tuning in that can give us a better idea of what's happening in the hot zone. So I look to Gigi's work on this. I look forward to working with her more on it, because it is very, very powerful work. All right, we'll take a couple more questions, and then we're going to wrap it up. It's a fantastic show tonight, really. It's X Series episode 65, Who is Tom Garden? And we've demonstrated Tom Garden was Tom Morgan, and that Tom Morgan is Sanche de Gramont. And let me tell you, I could spend a lot of time talking to you about the de Gramont family, so we're going to do some of that. Yes.
Okay, so David Tormina again. What if the apothium effects that caused it to sink were also timed to cause it to rise after a certain time?
There's no question. The way, it's a good point. When you think about how Cayce talks about it and how the mystery schools reference it, it's almost like it's on a clock. And when that time is past, when that time comes, and this is the beginning of that time, this is the first wave of the rising of these ruins. This is the language of the Cayce readings. And I do feel we have to study that language of the readings and go back and see exactly, as I've been doing a lot of this recently, which is going back into his work and reading it a little bit differently now that we know so many of the players and the things in the hot zone. And we start to figure out, what was he talking about? And he was going easy on us. He wasn't hitting us over the head. He was saying, these are the things that are happening. But whenever we get around Cayce and Atlantis, I feel like it's a rich vein of information. I don't feel that there's any mystery school information that's more complete in relation to Atlantis. I think that the Cayce work is a real revelation for Atlantis and Bimini, and it's almost like they were ready to give us the info, but definitely has a lot to do with timing, and I would say that plays out astrologically also, in that the astronomy has to be set just so. We don't know the answers to those things. I believe a lot of the mystery schools have those answers. I'm going to read this quick Cayce quote to kind of tune us back in on that. So he's talking about the two-eye stone, and they're asking him, well, what does this have to do with Atlantis's destruction? And he says, well, the forces from the two-eye stone were not intentionally tuned too high. So someone did this by accident. It's kind of like Chernobyl or something. Fukushima. And brought the second period of destructive forces to the peoples in the land, and broke up the land into isles that later became the periods when further destructive forces were brought to the land, like the same thing happened. Continuing with the reading. Through the same form of fire, the bodies of individuals were regenerated by the burning through the applications of the rays from the stone, the influences that brought destructive forces to an animal organism. Hence, the body rejuvenated itself often and remained in that land until the eventual destruction, joining with the peoples that made for the breaking up of that land, the Belial group. Now, this is very important, because he's saying that the same way that they motivated things and created flight, and that they could power their ships and power their cities, that they also used it to regenerate their bodies. That's very interesting, that's an interesting twist that I don't think we hear enough about. He also says, in describing the manner of construction of the stone, we find it was a large cylindrical glass, as would be termed today, cut with facets in such a manner that the capstone on top of same made for the centralizing of the power or force that concentrated between the end of the cylinder of the capstone itself. He's getting really technical about how it works. As indicated, the records, the manners of construction of same, that is, the manners of construction of a two-eye stone power station, are in 3 places in the earth as it stands today. In the sunken portions of Atlantis or Poseidia, where a portion of the temples may yet be discovered under the slime of ages of seawater near what is known as Bimini off the coast of Florida. I mean, it's undeniable he's saying this is where it is. And he also says in the temple records that were in Egypt, where the entity later acted in cooperation with others in preserving the records, that's where the Sphinx Hall of Records is. And that's under the Sphinx right paw and then between the Sphinx and the river, wherever, however you get into that. One of the things that they found when they were searching in Giza was the cave system. And there's a whole cave system. And they went to go check it out, and they got like 5 minutes in there, or bats and snakes and everything else. So unless you have a real organized search party, it's not going to happen. And then the last one was also the records that were carried to what is now Yucatan in America. That's the Yucatan Peninsula part for the hot zone, where these stones they know so little about are now, during the last few months, being uncovered. The little versions of the stones we've talked about, fire stones, they're kind of miniature versions of the two-eye stone, and he's saying in some of these ruins they actually found those. So I guess that kind of answers your question. They found elements of it, but I don't think they found the whole. But I do think they're looking for it. Okay, we'll take 2 more questions and we're done.
Okay, well, I just wanted to give Eric Ackerley an invitation to reach out to you directly, because he says, I talked with Howard Hughes when he was in Vancouver, BC in 71 or 72.
Wow.
He had rented the top 2 floors of the Bayshore Hotel. Very weird conversation. We are intrigued.
Hey, that's fantastic. Well, yeah, I mean, you can send it to info@darkjournalist.com, any contact information, and we'll definitely talk to you about that. That sounds, I'd be very, very curious what he had to say to you.
Okay.
Yes.
Catherine Pinot says, DJ, would you do a summary show sometime? It would be so cool to have a show that tied up the major points and gave us the 50,000-foot view, or write a book.
Wow.
Now, Catherine has never missed an X series episode.
Hey.
So, still, I think it would be great to do, we've been talking about that, sort of whether we fold it into an AMA show, you know?
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. No, it always needs an overview and a refocusing. There's no question about it. There's so many terms that we use that are just specific to the X series. Like Apotheum or Stealth Archives, it is, when you study this work, you need some kind of a way to kind of correlate it and not confuse it with other streams of information that are out there. So it has its own very kind of sovereign place that it interrelates with all the other information, but it sees it a little bit differently. So, things, the way that we look at the UFO file, for example, is different than, hey, we need to get this stuff out of the government. The CIA needs to take it over. That's all TTSA mind control stuff. And we see it very differently, which is we can get access to the UFO file information by working with the information that is available, and we can go a lot further, I think, in relation to the hot zone stuff by doing the expeditions. So, and using the research and the psychic component with it. So if you can draw in those things together and working with a very scientific basis on it, I think you can definitely, you can bring it into a totally different thing. It doesn't have to be just entertainment. Wouldn't it be great if there's an alien invasion or something? I think that you can go a lot further. So in terms of the book, I have to tell you, the way that my schedule operates, it would be very hard to imagine getting a book in there. But it's a tempting idea just to make sure. It's one of the things that Joseph Farrell told me, which is you really have to focus all of the work down into a single thing. But I think of the series that way. So I would love to do both, frankly. So we'll see how far we get. Miss Olivia.
Okay.
We'll make Olivia write the book. And
Oh, dear God, no. Okay, Les Dixon. Who was the first man who spoke about Atlantis? I don't know the answer to this question.
Well, one of the first kind of persons who spread it widely was Ignatius Donnelly. And he was a candidate for vice president, and he was a senator from Minnesota. And so he talked about it. If you think of the Mormons, actually, it is an Atlantean story because they talk about this group coming over the seas and landing in Mexico, So I think that when you go further back, there are references, but it's really the breakthrough, in my opinion, of the Theosophical Society that puts it on the map. And then from theosophy into Steiner's work, anthroposophy. There are references, there are ideas, but it's Plato who puts it on the record first, of course, in, he's 500 BC, and he talks about the Egyptian priest who says 9,000 years before now, so 9,500 BC, that's when the Atlanteans came and they fought to take over. So really it's Plato who puts it on the map, and then in a broader sense, people like Ignatius Donnelly, Augustus Le Plongeon, who was a fantastic archaeologist. No, he didn't have, sonar and all the tools we have now, but he had other things. He used psychic archaeology. So there have been these incredible steps, but I think one of the more notable people in the current wave who's not with us anymore is Dr. David Zink, and his research in Bimini in the 60s and 70s still stands heads and shoulders above the rest, as does Egerton Sykes' work, which is largely forgotten in circles of Atlantis research. Miss Olivia, the last question of the night is you.
This isn't so much a question as a lot of dots that I'd like you to connect.
Yes.
So Tessa1111 has been fantastic tonight.
Oh, yeah.
And so when we were discussing the connection between the American elites and the European aristocracy and the intelligence agencies, she brought up the Bilderberg Group and said they're all cousins, children of royals who can't inherit, not high enough on the food chain, headed for America early on, especially illegitimate children. One wonders if Ancestry.com is hunting for those children, that bloodline. I just love this, and I wanted to know what you had to say.
Yeah.
I used to really poo-poo the whole bloodline thing. I didn't, because...
No, it's very important.
Well, I just didn't see the value of it, because for me, I believe in reincarnation, and I think I've been every religion and every race. And so I didn't see why blood should be so important, why lineage should be so important. So this has been a big learning curve for me. And I'm starting, even though I don't think personally so far that blood and genetics are all that important, because I think it's the soul that's important. I am starting to understand that other people, certain people on this planet, really put a high value on that. And so therefore I need to learn more about that and why they value it.
No question. Well, the blood ritual, is very deep in occult literature, in occult background, those ceremonies relating to it. And I think that there's no question that there are bloodlines that relate directly to the earlier cultures. What's funny is they have the haplogroup, which is haplogroup X, and that's the one they associate with Atlantis, oddly enough. So those researchers come up over and over again. There's early influences of that group when they study it in America, in Mexico, in Central America. So I think that we're going to get more answers along that line. It's an excellent thing to point out, which is sites that do that type of testing could be testing for something totally different than what they're set up to do. I remember that, I had this conversation with Catherine Austin Fitz about when they were using the scanners, and that they had a whole different set of what they could use. They had radio scanners that did the same thing, but they wanted the radiation X-ray scanner to get something. They wanted to be able to track something in the population, and maybe that was a way to do it. So if you had a different type of human, I'm trying to think of the name of the guy who wrote that book about the crypto.
Terrestrials?
Yes.
Oh, I can picture the book, but
McTenney.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Tawny's.
McTawny's.
Mhm.
And that's a very interesting little book, because the idea there, and, it's definitely swinging for the fences, but the idea was that there was a group on the planet that was just a little bit more, not a lot more advanced than we were, and that they were engaged in these elite activities trying to kind of control things, and that, they were just outside of the grasp. They weren't really, and that they largely lived underground. I loved some of the things that he was looking into, and he died young, unfortunately. And a lot of people thought that was very suspicious, given the type of research that he was doing.
Are we ever going to do a show at Tawny's?
But he's definitely going to be included, no question about it. Yeah.
Okay.
But I want to say that I think that we need to open our minds without being superstitious about it. To some of these other types of realities, and really get a handle on it. I think that even the mystery schools themselves, and the idea of ascended masters and stuff, that's such a mystery, and we really need to have a handle on what the legacy of those schools coming out public for us, like the Rosicrucians and like anthroposophy and Steiner's work. Steiner's work plays so well in the 21st century. It's like he might as well have been a time traveler to start with. And it's remarkable. But he's saying there's this legacy from the mystery schools, and that they are, they've been moving this out since the 1840s now. So let's think about that. We're looking at 175 some odd years of them working the public with this information, trying to give it so the culture moves forward instead of drowning into the scientific materialism, which is what we've been drowning in. So we need a new method. And the mystery schools were there, I think, to set us up and give us that information. Unfortunately, we have the secret societies who are working on the left-hand side, the darker aspects, and they are, in fact, locking down so much of humanity. And, they're on the move. So I guess we're on the move. That's the way I'd answer that. Fantastic
It is
question.
a race.
It is, yeah. Yeah, that's a good way to put it, actually.
Okay, I'm going to let Esoteric 369 Wall have the last question. It's a great question.
Yes.
Do you think a mystery school spirit was channeling through Edgar Cayce?
Oh, yes. They identify in the Cayce readings Cayce's role with the mystery schools. And they also say at certain points, when they get asked too many questions, after they mention something in relation to the Rosicrucian mystery school, they say, in terms of Cayce's relation to him and our influence on him, this can't be given at this juncture. So he's the, it's funny because Steiner talks about when they decided at a certain point they couldn't work with Blavatsky anymore and they withdrew, which was a very dangerous thing to do because it left her and her organization to be the plaything of all these other forces. He said that they developed an idea to do something else, and I think that something else was the Cayce work, because they decided to work through an individual, and they needed to work through the Western Mystery School tract about the esoteric Christian mysteries, bringing reincarnation and meditation into Christian ideas, so that the people who were holding the Christian vision could work with things like chakras and all the rest of these ideas. This is crucial. This is a crucial change, and I think it made a tremendous impact. And that Cayce, as they call him, the father of holistic medicine, he's also the father of giving us that bigger picture of Atlantis. And I think that between Steiner's work and Cayce's work, you get a really good picture of how important that is. Amazing stuff tonight. Great question, Gail. And Gail was at our Graham Hancock event. Thank you so much for coming. We are going to have more events coming up, by the way, too. So make sure you signed up for the newsletter so you get those announcements. Subscribe to the show. Get behind the work that we're doing here. We've made it very, very inexpensive so everyone can get on board. Go to darkjournalist.com and contribute, and also sign up for our newsletter, and we'll send it to you every Friday. We will be back next week at 8 p.m. with an amazing new show, X series. And Miss Olivia, the last question goes for you.
Well, first I want to actually give a shout out to W.C. Ray,
Yes.
Matt M., Liberty Thunder, and Eric Ackerley
Nice.
for their generous donations.
Fantastic.
And do you want one last question?
Sure.
Well, I mean, just to round it all out.
Yeah.
Okay, so Nancy Miller asks, who targeted the Bahamas with the hurricane and why? And Scarlet Fire said, maybe DARPA sent the hurricane to the Bahamas to destroy ancient evidence. It did hover over the island kind of artificially.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. I think it's interesting that the Bahamas got so pummeled this time.
There's something everybody seems to acknowledge, that this was not natural.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you this too, which is weather modification is something that was admitted to by William Cohen, who was the Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton. But it's something that JFK mentioned in his UN speech in 1963, that we had the ability to do this. So again, that's X-Share, right? Trying to tell everyone we have this ability, while X-Protect would probably use it the way that we're talking about. It's hard to say. I mean, some things that are weather manipulated have a definite signature, like the California fires. So you do get major hurricanes, but do they get enhanced in the disaster capitalism that goes on? There's a lot of strange things there, and I wouldn't put it past these people who would use weather modification that way. Now, interestingly enough, that type of disaster may uncover things that are hidden ordinarily. Even the Bimini Wall, remember, at a certain point showed up in only 20 feet of water. So we had that ability to see it finally. So the ruins are definitely there. It's just the ability of getting at it. I will say this also, with the type of technology that they have and the ability to scan from the sky, they probably know the location of a great deal of the ruins. No question about it. Fantastic crowd tonight. We will see you all next Friday. And I want you to have a wonderful weekend. I do see a few familiar faces out there. Jay Mallet, Thomas Dyson, channeling the heart. Barbara Joyce, it's great to see you out there. Thanks so much. And of course, Gigi, it was great to have you tonight. We will see you all next week. And remember, we've got Tom Garden. Now let's see if we can see the power structure behind who's manipulating the hot zone. This is where we're headed. And it definitely brings us right into the Bimini, Cuba cross there. So we're right at those crossroads. We will be back next week. And Miss Olivia, the last word is, what's up for?
Oh my God, I'm starving. We didn't have time to have dinner before the show started, so I'm starving. At whatever is the quickest, I think probably onion rings. It's about 12 minutes and we'll be eating.
That sounds like a way to go. Najat, it was great to see you out there. Thanks so much, everyone. And I think onion rings do it. Maybe it's almost like, what's weird is in Cambridge, the temperature is dropping crazy, so you almost want like hot chocolate or something.
That's true.
Unbelievable.
Mm-hmm. That's going to be in the 50s.
Yes, we'll take a hot chocolate no chaser. We'll see you all later, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Great to be with you. And boy, great to have Olivia back. Isn't it now? Unbelievable round of applause for Miss Olivia. Nicely done.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone. It's funny because it says end broadcast, but I know it's not ended. It never ends. Remember that. Never ends.